The barometer on the bridge of the Pacific Meridian read 983 millibars when I came on watch at 4 in the morning on the 5th day out of Shanghai. I checked it the way I checked everything at the start of a watch. Out of habit, out of discipline, the way you run your hand along a wall in a dark room, not because you expect to find anything, but because you've learned that the things you don't check are the things that surprise you. 983. Normal atmospheric pressure sits around 1013. 30 points below normal is not an emergency. It's not even, strictly speaking, alarming. But it is a number that goes into a certain part of your brain and stays there, quiet, while you get on with the rest of your watch. I got on with my watch. I made my coffee. I checked the navigation instruments. I confirmed our position and heading. I looked out at the Pacific Ocean in the dark and saw exactly what I expected to see. Open water, the faint smear of stars where the cloud cover hadn't moved in yet. The long, slow swells that had been our constant companion for 5 days. Everything looked normal. The barometer said something different. I noted it in my log and kept watching. By noon that day, it read 995. By 6 in the evening, it was 988. Numbers moving in the wrong direction, slowly, steadily, without drama. The ocean doesn't announce what it's planning. It just starts adjusting the conditions, one small degree at a time, until the adjustment is so large that there's nothing left to do but respond to it. I've spent 12 years learning to read those adjustments. On that particular evening, in that particular stretch of the North Pacific, what I was reading was the leading edge of Typhoon Merrick, and what Merrick was about to do to us, to our ship, to every one of the 20 men aboard her, was something that none of us, not one, had experienced before. Not at that scale. Not with that kind of sustained, total, remorseless force. I'm telling this story because I was the helmsman on watch when it hit us. I held the controls through the worst of it, and what I saw and felt and heard in those 18 hours is the kind of thing that doesn't leave you. Not the fear of it, not the details of it, not the faces of the men around me when we understood, all of us, at roughly the same moment, that the outcome was genuinely uncertain. We made it through. All 20 of us made it through. But the distance between making it through and not making it through was, at certain points that night, closer than I am comfortable describing even now, years later, sitting somewhere dry and still and very far from the North Pacific. I'll describe it anyway, because the men on that ship deserve to have it told accurately, and because the ocean deserves the same. My name is Daniel Reeves. I grew up in Astoria, Oregon, which sits at the mouth of the Columbia River where it meets the Pacific, and which is the kind of town where the water is not scenery. It's just the edge of the world, the thing that's always there at the end of every street that runs west. My father worked on fishing boats out of the port there for most of my childhood. Not romantic work, not the kind of thing that generates stories worth telling at dinner. Early mornings, cold water, physical labor, the particular exhaustion that comes from working in conditions that don't make allowances for how tired you are. But he came home. Every trip, he came home. And I watched that, year after year, and absorbed something from it that I couldn't have articulated at the time but understand clearly now. That the sea is a place where competence is the only currency that matters. Not personality, not luck in any sustained sense, not the ability to project confidence or manage impressions, just competence. Knowing your job precisely and doing it precisely, and being honest with yourself about the difference between what you know and what you're guessing. I signed on as an ordinary seaman at 23, after 2 years of maritime training in Astoria, and a stint at a merchant marine academy that I attended on a combination of financial aid and stubborn determination to not spend my life doing anything else. The first years were West Coast runs, container feeder services, bulk carriers, a few tanker rotations that I found technically interesting and personally unpleasant. I moved up through the ratings as most people do in this industry, through a combination of sea time and examinations, and the gradual accumulation of the kind of judgment that can only come from actually being out there when things go sideways. I made able seamen, then qualified member of the engine department for a period when I was cross-training, then back to deck as a qualified helmsman. By my mid-30s, I was working deep water crossings, trans-Pacific routes, North Atlantic runs, occasional work in the South China Sea. The Pacific Meridian was not my first container ship, but she was the one I'd been on longest, and by the time of this voyage, I knew her the way you know a place you've lived in for years. Not just the layout, but the sounds, the specific vibrations of her engine at different speeds, the way she handled in beam seas versus head seas, the particular complaints she made when the weather pushed her beyond what she preferred to do. The Pacific Meridian was a modern container ship, built in South Korea 8 years before this voyage, 202 meters from bow to stern. To put that in terms that mean something if you've never stood next to a ship that size, she was roughly as long as 2 football fields placed end to end, and the deck above the cargo holds was wide enough to drive a car across without difficulty. She could carry 2,200 standard containers, the steel boxes, each one 20 feet long, that carry essentially everything that moves by sea between Asia and North America. Those containers were stacked on her deck 6 units high in places, and in the holds below deck as well, locked to each other and to the ship's structure with mechanical fasteners called twist locks. A twist lock is a heavy steel fitting, roughly the size of a large thermos, that connects the corner of one container to the corner of the one below it and locks with a quarter turn. When it's properly set, it holds tens of thousands of pounds of loaded steel in place against the motion of a ship at sea. When the forces acting on it exceed what it was designed to handle, which is a condition that most ships go through their entire working lives never encountering, the fitting fails. We'll come back to that. The ship's main engine was a large marine diesel, the kind that in terms of raw output produces around 22,000 horsepower, enough to push a structure weighing 20,000 tons through calm water at close to 20 knots, which is roughly 23 miles per hour. That sounds slow until you consider what's being moved and through what medium. In the conditions we encountered during Typhoon Merrick, that same engine, running at its maximum continuous rating, was moving us at 3 to 4 knots against the sea. Walking pace. A fast walk. The ocean was absorbing everything the engine could produce and giving back almost nothing. That's not a malfunction. That's physics. And understanding that the size and power of a vessel like this, which feels absolute and overwhelming when you're standing next to it in a calm harbor, becomes genuinely relative the moment the Pacific decides to demonstrate its own scale. That understanding is, I think, the foundation of what it means to work on ships for a living. You are always the smaller thing. The only question is how well prepared the smaller thing is. Our crew was 20 men, and I want to tell you about them properly, because what happened during those 18 hours was not the story of a ship surviving a typhoon. It was the story of 20 specific people doing specific things under conditions that tested every one of them completely. And the outcome depended on all of them in ways that were not evenly distributed or fairly arranged. Some of them had the hardest jobs and received the least recognition. And I want that on record before I get to the storm itself. Captain James Holloway was 54 years old, originally from Savannah, Georgia, and had been sailing container ships for 26 years at the time of this voyage. He was not a large man, medium height, unremarkable build, the kind of person you would not particularly notice in a room full of people, which I always thought was interesting given that at sea he was the absolute center of every decision, and the person on whose judgment every other person's safety ultimately rested. He spoke quietly and rarely repeated himself. His briefings were short and complete. His decisions arrived without the visible deliberation that less experienced commanders sometimes display, not because he wasn't thinking, but because his thinking happened faster than it showed. I had worked one previous voyage under Holloway and had formed a clear opinion of him. He was the best captain I had sailed under, and I had sailed under 8. First Officer Marcus Webb was 39, born in Kharkiv, Ukraine, and had come to the American Merchant Marine through a complicated path that involved maritime school in Odessa, several years on European-flagged vessels, and eventually U.S. permanent residency through a maritime skills visa. He was meticulous in a way that occasionally frustrated the crew. He kept records of everything, questioned procedures that other officers accepted without examination, and had opinions about the correct way to do almost every task that fell under his authority. During Typhoon Merrick, that meticulousness was not frustrating. It was essential. He kept the ship's log current throughout the night with timestamps and factual entries that would later form the basis of the official incident report. And he maintained radio contact with the Coast Guard on the required schedule without being reminded once. Chief Engineer Raymond Park was 50 years old, Korean-American, raised in Los Angeles, and had spent his career in marine engineering with the focus and completeness of a man who simply could not imagine doing anything else. He talked about engines the way some people talk about music, with a fluency and pleasure that came from knowing the subject not just technically, but intimately. His relationship with the Pacific Meridian's main engine was one of professional mutual respect, and I mean that in the most literal sense. He knew what the engine could do. He knew what it couldn't do, and he had the experience to manage it in real time in conditions where the gap between those two things was being actively tested. Electrical engineer Tommy Reyes was 28 years old, from Cebu in the Philippines, and was the quietest person on the ship by a margin significant enough to be noticeable. He did his work, attended meals, stood his watches, and offered conversation when directly invited and not much otherwise. I had worked alongside him for 4 months by the time of this voyage and knew him primarily through the quality of his work, which was excellent, and through a few conversations about his family back in Cebu, a wife, a young daughter, a house he was paying for with his sea wages, and planned to finish building on his next shore leave. What Tommy did during the night of Typhoon Merrick, alone in the engine room with a set of tools and a generator that was failing in ways that would have darkened the entire ship if he hadn't stopped it, is something I will describe in full when we get to that part of the night. I want you to already be thinking about him, about who he is and what he was working toward, and what it means that a 28-year-old man with a daughter he was trying to build a house for spent 40 minutes alone on a shaking platform in a 100-degree engine room, fixing something that nobody else on the ship knew was broken. Bosun Carl Briggs was from Coos Bay, Oregon. We were both Oregon coastmen, which formed the basis of a comfortable working relationship that required very little actual conversation. Carl was the senior deck rating, responsible for the maintenance and condition of everything on the ship's exterior: rigging, deck equipment, hatch covers, mooring lines, anchor systems. He was physically large, practically silent, and completely reliable in the specific way that the best tradespeople are reliable. He knew what needed doing. He did it, and he didn't require supervision or encouragement to do it correctly. Our cook, Luis Garza, was 41 years old and from San Antonio, Texas, and is, I will state without any qualification, the most important person on a ship of 20 men in the middle of a long ocean crossing. Not the most dramatic, not the most technically skilled in the ways that are easy to point to, but the most important in the sense that the physical and psychological condition of a crew over weeks at sea is substantially determined by whether they are eating well and whether the space where they eat feels like a place where human beings are cared for. Luis understood this without needing it explained. He ran a clean galley, produced real food rather than the institutional approximation of food that some ships accept as normal, and had a manner in the mess room that made the ordinary act of sitting down to eat feel like something worth doing. During Typhoon Merrick, with 2 cracked ribs he had sustained in the galley during the worst of the storm, he produced food for 20 men at the first opportunity the conditions allowed, and delivered it personally to every station on the ship. I don't know how to make that sound as significant as it was, so I'll just say it plainly. Luis Garza pushed a food cart through a ship that was still moving in heavy residual seas, with 2 cracked ribs, because he understood that the men who had been awake and working for 18 hours needed to eat, and that was his job. And he did his job. Ryan Fletcher was 22 years old and from Portland, Oregon, and was on his first deep water crossing as a cadet, which meant he was in the process of accumulating the sea time required for his officer certification, and was, for the purposes of this voyage, learning by being present. I noticed him on the first day out of Shanghai because of his posture on the bridge. The way he stood at the windows and looked at the water with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who are genuinely seeing something for the first time and know it. I had that posture once. Most sailors do, at the beginning. The ocean either takes it from you or transforms it into something more durable and less innocent. And which of those things happens depends on what the ocean decides to show you and how early. What the Pacific Ocean showed Ryan Fletcher on his first deep-water crossing was Typhoon Merrick. And he was on the bridge for all of it, and he stood up to it completely. And I watched it transform him in real time over the course of one very long night. We had departed Shanghai on a Tuesday morning through the crowded approaches of the Yangtze River Delta, one of the busiest shipping corridors in the world, where vessels of every size and description move in patterns that look chaotic from the outside and are governed by a detailed system of separation schemes and traffic rules that require constant attention to navigate safely. Clearing the approaches and getting into open water took most of the first day, and by the second day we were in the North Pacific proper, on our Great Circle route toward Los Angeles, a curved path that swings north toward the Aleutian Islands before curving back south toward California. Longer on a flat map, but shorter on the actual surface of a sphere. The weather for the first 4 days was what the North Pacific offers in late summer when it's being cooperative. Long swells from the northwest, overcast skies, wind in the 15 to 20 knot range that kept the air cool on deck and produced a steady background motion aboard the ship that became so normal so quickly, you stopped noticing it. The cargo was 2,200 containers of the ordinary commerce of the modern world. Electronics manufactured in Guangdong province, clothing from factories in Zhejiang, furniture components, industrial machinery parts, household appliances, agricultural equipment. Refrigerated containers carrying fruit and processed food that needed to stay cold for the crossing. I don't think about the cargo during a voyage any more than a truck driver thinks about the specific contents of the trailer behind him on the highway. It's there. It's accounted for in the manifest. It's somebody else's problem until it needs to be delivered. The morning of day 5, I came on watch at 4 o'clock and checked the barometer and noted the reading in my log. And something in the back of my mind went quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of a routine watch. 983 millibars. I made my coffee. I watched the water. By the time my watch ended at 8 o'clock, I had checked the barometer 4 more times. It was still falling. Somewhere out there in the Western Pacific, Typhoon Merrick was making its plans. And none of us yet knew that those plans included us. The weather briefing happened at 10 o'clock on the morning of day 5, in the chart room just aft of the bridge, with Holloway, Webb, Raymond Park, and me present. Webb had pulled the latest satellite imagery and the routing service forecast and laid it out on the table, a printed chart with the Typhoon's projected track overlaid in a series of dotted lines representing the cone of probable movement, the kind of image that weather services produce to communicate uncertainty honestly rather than false precision. Typhoon Merrick was centered approximately 800 miles to our southwest, moving northeast at around 12 knots, with sustained winds near the center of 130 miles per hour, and a pressure reading that put it firmly in the category of a major typhoon. The projected track, based on the models available that morning, had the storm recurving, turning from its northeast heading toward a more northerly direction, well to our west, and then continuing north and eventually northeast again, passing several hundred miles behind us as we moved east. On paper, with those numbers, we had a reasonable buffer. 300 miles of separation at closest approach, maybe 350. In the open ocean, 300 miles is not nothing. It's a full day's steaming at normal speed. It's the distance from Los Angeles to San Francisco and back. Holloway studied the chart for a long time without speaking. Then he asked Webb about the confidence interval on the track forecast, how reliable the projected path was likely to be given the current steering patterns in the upper atmosphere. Webb said what any honest meteorologist would have said. Reasonable confidence for the next 24 hours, decreasing significantly after that. Typhoon track forecasting is not an imprecise science in the way that, say, long-range temperature forecasting is imprecise. But it is genuinely difficult, because tropical systems interact with large-scale atmospheric patterns that shift, and a shift of even a few degrees in the steering flow can translate to a track deviation of hundreds of miles over a day or two. Holloway nodded, looked at the chart for another long moment, and made the call to continue on course while monitoring. That was the right call. I want to be clear about that, because what happened later might make it tempting to look back at that morning briefing and find a mistake. There was no mistake. There was a forecast, and a reasonable decision based on that forecast, and then the storm did what storms sometimes do. By noon on day 5, the barometer had recovered slightly, 991, and the swells from the southwest were long and deep, but not alarming. The ship rode them in the way a ship her size is supposed to ride long ocean swells. A slow, rolling pitch that you feel more in the stomach than in the feet. A movement that becomes so habitual after a few days at sea that you only notice it when it stops. The sky to the southwest had a particular quality that I've learned to pay attention to over 12 years. Not dark, not threatening in any conventional sense, but heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was under pressure from something a long way away. High cirrus clouds, the thin, wispy kind that form at very high altitude, were streaming northeast overhead in long parallel bands. Cirrus clouds moving ahead of a tropical system are one of the oldest and most reliable signs that something significant is approaching. They're not cause for immediate action. They're cause for attention. I mentioned them to Webb when I passed through the bridge after lunch. He looked up at the sky through the forward windows, nodded once, and went back to his chart. He'd seen them too. Everyone who knew what to look for had seen them. That evening at 6 o'clock, Holloway received an updated forecast from the routing service, and the chart room gathered again. The updated track had shifted. Merrick had not recurved as projected. The storm had continued northeast longer than the models expected, and the new cone of probable positions had its western edge significantly closer to our track than the morning forecast. Not on top of us, not yet, but close enough that the comfortable buffer of the morning briefing had narrowed in a way that changed the calculation. Holloway looked at the numbers, looked at our position, looked at the distance and timing, and then he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "The storm is going to decide this, not us." He wasn't being fatalistic. He was being accurate. We could adjust our speed, we could alter our course within limits, but we were a ship moving at 18 knots through an ocean, and Merrick was a Typhoon 300 miles across moving at 12 knots through the same ocean, and the geometry of the situation was going to resolve itself according to the storm's behavior, not ours. What we could do was prepare the ship for the worst case and hope the forecast improved. We began preparing the ship. What that preparation looks like in practice is not dramatic. There is no single action, no switch to throw or alarm to sound that puts a ship in storm-ready condition. It's a series of methodical steps carried out by specific people in specific parts of the vessel, each one small and unglamorous and absolutely necessary. Carl Briggs took his deck crew through the exterior of the ship from bow to stern, checking every hatch cover, every deck fitting, every piece of equipment that was exposed to weather. Hatch covers are the large steel panels that seal the cargo holds below deck. Each one weighs several tons and is secured by a series of clamping mechanisms around its perimeter. In a major storm, a hatch cover that isn't properly dogged down can be lifted by wave impact and flood the hold below. Carl checked every one personally, not delegating the final verification to anyone else. Raymond Park ran his engine room through a full systems check. Bilge pumps tested and confirmed operational. Emergency generators started and run up to load. All auxiliary systems verified. The bilge pumps are the machines that remove water from the lowest parts of the ship's interior. In a severe storm, water gets into places it's not supposed to be. Through ventilation openings, through fittings under stress, through places you didn't expect. And the pumps are what keep that water from accumulating to dangerous levels. Testing them before the storm, rather than discovering they have a problem during it, is the difference between a precaution and a crisis. Tommy Reyes went through the electrical systems, switchboards, generator connections, emergency lighting circuits, with the same methodical attention that characterized everything he did. On the bridge, Webb secured loose equipment and confirmed that the emergency radio equipment was fully operational and that our EPIRB, the Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, a device that automatically transmits our location to rescue services if it's submerged in water, was properly mounted and armed. Luis Garza, in the galley, made a large hot meal and told nobody directly, but communicated clearly through the quantity and quality of what he produced that this was the last real dinner for a while. And everyone who sat down to eat that evening understood it without being told. I ate well. I went to my cabin after dinner and sat on my bunk and looked at the photograph of Sarah and the kids on the shelf above my desk. The one from the Oregon coast the previous summer. All three of them laughing at something I'd said that I can't even remember now. And I thought about calling her. I decided to wait. I told myself I'd call when we were through it, when I had something definitive to tell her. That was partly practical, and partly the particular kind of dishonesty you practice with the people you love when you're in a situation that you don't want to make real by describing it out loud. The night of day 5 passed without incident in the most technical sense. The ship moved, the watches changed, the engine ran, nothing broke. But the ocean was already changing. The swells from the southwest had lengthened and steepened overnight, and by my 4 o'clock watch on the morning of day 6, they had a character that was fundamentally different from the previous days. Long ocean swells, the kind generated by a distant storm system, have a particular quality that's difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. They're not rough. They don't break. They're just very large, very slow movements of the entire water surface. Deep water waves that have traveled sometimes thousands of miles from where they were generated. And what they communicate is not immediate danger, but the existence of something enormous somewhere behind them. The Pacific Meridian was rising and falling through 15-foot swells in the dark, her bow lifting in long, slow arcs and then descending into troughs that felt deeper than they looked. And the motion was not violent, but it was insistent, and it had a quality I can only describe as intentional, as if the ocean was leaning on us steadily to see what we'd do. The barometer that morning read 979, down from 991 the previous afternoon. 12 millibars in 18 hours. That rate of fall is not normal. It's the kind of number that ends any remaining uncertainty about what's coming and replaces it with a different and more focused kind of attention. I noted it in the log, informed the watch officer, and felt the thing in the back of my mind that had been quiet since the previous morning become something more active. Not panic. I want to be precise about this, because I think people imagine that experienced sailors in dangerous weather operate in a state of elevated adrenaline, heart pounding, fear running just below the surface of every action. That's not how it works, or at least it's not how it worked for me. What I felt was a kind of sharpening, a narrowing of attention onto the instruments and the sea and the feel of the ship under my feet, a setting aside of everything that wasn't immediately relevant. 12 years of ocean time had trained me to respond to developing danger not with panic, but with focus. And the focus came automatically, the way breathing comes automatically, without requiring a decision. The updated forecast arrived at 9 o'clock on the morning of day 6, and it changed everything. Merrick had continued its unexpected northeast track through the night, and it also intensified. The central pressure had dropped further. The sustained winds had increased, and the storm was now being classified as a super typhoon, the highest category designation for tropical cyclones in the Western Pacific. A super typhoon is not simply a strong typhoon. It represents a level of organization and intensity where the storm has achieved something close to maximum efficiency. The spiral bands of thunderstorms feeding the central circulation in a way that sustains and even increases the system's strength. The eye wall contracted to a tight ring of the most extreme conditions on the planet's surface. And this particular super typhoon had, overnight, turned north. Its track had shifted from northeast to almost due north, which placed us, our position, our ship, our 20 men, directly in the projected path of the storm's northeast quadrant. The northeast quadrant of a typhoon in the northern hemisphere is called the dangerous semicircle, and it earns that name. The winds in a typhoon rotate counterclockwise when viewed from above, and in the northeast quadrant, the storm's own forward motion adds to the wind speed rather than subtracting from it. A storm moving north at 15 knots with maximum winds of 150 miles per hour will, in its northeast quadrant, produce effective wind speeds of 165 miles per hour or more. It is the worst place to be relative to a tropical system, and the forecast now had us in it. Holloway studied the chart for a long time. Then he looked at our options. We could increase speed and try to run east, ahead of the storm. We could slow down and let it pass ahead of us. We could alter course to the south and try to get into the less dangerous western semicircle. He worked through each option with Webb at the chart table, running the time and distance math on each scenario, looking at the storm's projected speed and our own, looking at the uncertainty in the track forecast. Every option had a problem. Running east required the storm to continue on its current track and not accelerate. Not guaranteed. Slowing down put us in the storm's path for longer. Going south meant turning toward the storm's center, which in itself created risk. There was no clean answer. There rarely is in these situations. What there is a best available option given imperfect information, and Holloway made his call. Alter course 20 degrees south and increase to maximum speed, trying to put as much sea room as possible between us and the storm's projected center, while accepting that we were going to experience significant weather regardless. That course change bought us perhaps 50 miles of additional separation from the storm's center over the next 24 hours. 50 miles. In a typhoon 300 miles across, 50 miles is the difference between the outer edge and somewhat further out from the outer edge. It was not nothing. But it was also not enough to change the fundamental reality of what was coming. The afternoon of day 6 was the last normal period of the voyage. Normal in the sense that the ship was operating, the crew was going about their routines, the engine was running at increased power on the new course, and the weather, while deteriorating, was still within the range of serious but manageable. The swells were now consistently in the 20-foot range, and the ship was moving through them in a way that required attention, but not alarm. Pitching moderately, rolling 10 to 15 degrees in the beam component of the swell, the motion assertive enough that you braced yourself when moving through corridors and held something when you needed both hands free for a task. Luis made dinner. Everyone ate. The mess room was quieter than usual, not because there was tension exactly, but because people were in the particular internal state that precedes something difficult. Conserving energy, not wasting words. Ryan Fletcher came to the bridge after dinner and asked if he could stay for the evening watch. I was on watch at 8, and I told him yes, and he sat in the observer's chair on the port side and watched the sea as the light faded and the swell increased and the wind, which had been around 30 knots when I came on, climbed to 35, then 40, then 45 over the next 2 hours. At 45 knots of sustained wind, the sea surface loses its normal appearance. The wave crests begin to blow off. The tops of the waves are stripped by the wind and driven horizontally as dense sheets of spray, and the distinction between air and water at sea level becomes genuinely ambiguous. You can't see through it from a distance. You can barely see through it when it's hitting the bridge windows. The sound of it against the glass is a continuous roar that rises and falls as the gusts pulse through. I stood at the helm that evening and felt the ship moving beneath me in ways that were new. Not violent yet, but larger than anything in the previous days. The motion more complex, the behavior less predictable. And somewhere out in the dark to our southwest, Typhoon Merrick was still coming. Still intensifying. Still closing the distance. I checked the barometer at 10 o'clock. 961 millibars. I noted the number in the log and did not say anything about it to Ryan, who was still sitting in the observer's chair, watching, both hands on the armrests, learning what the ocean looks like when it starts to mean business. The autopilot failed at 10:47 in the evening. Not dramatically. There was no alarm, no sudden loss of control, no indication that anything catastrophic had occurred. The status light on the control console changed from green to amber. A single quiet tone sounded, and the system transferred steering control back to manual. That was it. That was the moment the night became something different from anything I had experienced before. I took the helm. On a modern container ship, the helm is not the large wooden wheel from old maritime films. It's a control interface, a joystick-style input connected to the hydraulic system that moves the rudder, the large fin at the very back of the ship below the waterline that determines which direction the vessel goes. In calm water or moderate weather, the autopilot manages this continuously and accurately, making small corrections dozens of times per minute to keep the ship on its programmed heading. In severe conditions, when the ship is yawing, swinging its bow off course to one side and then the other, the way a car fishtails on ice, the corrections required become larger and more frequent. And eventually, the autopilot's programming reaches the limit of what it can handle and hands control to a human being. The human being was me. The wind at that point was 62 knots, just over 70 miles per hour of sustained wind, not gusting, sustained. The waves were running at 18 to 20 feet with confused cross swells from two directions, which meant the ship's motion was not the predictable pitching and rolling of a single-direction sea, but something more complex and less manageable, a combination of movements that made the deck feel unstable in a way that required continuous physical adjustment just to stand. I planted my feet wide, bent my knees slightly to let my legs absorb the motion, and put my hands on the controls. And for the next 10 hours, with 2 brief interruptions when my relief took over and found the conditions beyond his experience level, I did not leave that position. What holding a course manually means in those conditions is difficult to explain to someone who hasn't done it, and I want to try, because it matters for understanding what the next several hours actually required. The ship wants to turn. In a heavy sea, the forces acting on the hull from wave impacts are constantly pushing the bow to one side or the other, and without continuous correction, the vessel will swing off course and eventually come around broadside to the waves. Broadside to waves of this size, in a ship with the hull shape of a container vessel, is a catastrophic situation. The technical term is being caught in the trough, and what it means in practical terms is that the ship, lying parallel to the wave crests, is exposed to the full rolling force of each wave with nothing. No angle, no bow to cut through, to mitigate it. At the wave heights we were experiencing, a container ship caught broadside and unable to recover could roll past the angle from which her stability would bring her back upright. That angle, for a vessel like the Pacific Meridian in her loading condition that night, was somewhere around 45 degrees of tilt. We were hitting 30 to 35 regularly by midnight. The margin between where we were and where we couldn't come back from was 10 degrees of roll. 10 degrees is not a large number. In terms of what it looks like from inside the ship, it's the difference between very difficult and impossible, between a deck you can stand on with effort and a deck that has become a wall. My job was to keep us off that wall. I did it by watching the bow, watching the compass, feeling the ship's motion through my feet and hands, and making corrections. Right rudder, left rudder, hold it, ease off. Continuously, without interruption, in real time, responding to what the ship was doing before it finished doing it. After an hour, my lower back was aching from the constant bracing. After 2 hours, my forearms were burning from the grip and the continuous small movements of the controls. After 3 hours, the pain was simply there, a fact of the situation, something that existed alongside the work, but didn't interrupt it. The mind goes to a particular place in sustained physical stress. Narrow, quiet, focused entirely on the task, with everything else pushed to the periphery. I wasn't thinking about Sarah or the kids, or what would happen if we didn't make it through. I was thinking about the next wave. then the one after that. That's all. That's enough. Captain Holloway stood at the forward windows of the bridge and did not sit down. I want to say that again because it matters. For the entire duration of the worst of the storm, Holloway stood. He tracked the instruments. He communicated with the engine room on the intercom. He maintained contact with the Coast Guard on the emergency frequency. He gave me course corrections in a voice that had no particular coloring to it. Not calm in a performative way, just functional. Just the words that needed to be said. Come right 10 degrees. Hold that. Ease back. Watch your heading. Occasionally, he would move to the radar display and study it for a long moment, then return to the windows. He drank coffee at some point. I saw the cup in his hand, and I have no idea when he found time to pour it, or who brought it to him. Ryan Fletcher was still in the observer's chair. He had been there for hours. At some point in the middle of the night, I became aware that he was no longer just watching, but was doing something active with his attention, tracking the instruments himself, looking at the compass heading after each wave, following the logic of what I was doing with the helm. He wasn't in the way. He wasn't asking questions. He was learning, in the most direct possible way, what this work actually consists of when the conditions require everything it has. Marcus Webb stood at the chart table and wrote in the ship's log. I remember looking over at him at some point around midnight and feeling something between admiration and genuine bewilderment at the sight of him writing in legible sentences while the ship rolled 30 degrees and everything not secured was moving. He caught my look. He didn't say anything. He went back to writing. That was Marcus Webb. The engine room during all of this was a world I could not see and could only partially understand through the intercom and through the behavior of the ship herself. What I knew was that Raymond Park and his team were down there in conditions that were, in important ways, harder than what we were dealing with on the bridge. The bridge has windows. You can see the sea. You can see what's coming. You can orient yourself relative to the horizon, even when the horizon is barely visible through spray and darkness. In the engine room, there are no windows. There is no horizon. There is only the machinery and the heat, always over 100 degrees in that space, and the motion of the ship, which at the lower levels of the hull is more pronounced and more disorienting than anywhere else on board. And there is noise. The main engine of a ship this size produces a sound level that makes normal conversation impossible without communication headsets. You work in it, around it, through it, but you never stop being aware of it. And in a heavy storm, when the engine is under variable load from the propeller alternately biting deep water and spinning free in air as the stern rises on wave crests, the sound changes character in ways that a trained ear reads as information. Raymond's ear was trained. Every time the stern rose and the propeller came out of the water, the engines surged. The revolutions spiked suddenly as the resistance disappeared. If that surge goes unchecked, the engine can over-rev and damage itself, or, worse, trip an automatic safety shutdown and stop. A stopped engine in a Typhoon is a ship that will be broadside to the sea within minutes. Raymond's team caught every surge. They managed the fuel input manually, by hand, by feel, for the entire duration of the storm. Every single time. I didn't know the specific details of what they were doing while I was at the helm. I knew the engine was running because I could feel it through the deck. That was enough. That was everything. At 1:23 in the morning, I know the exact time because Marcus logged it. The sound came. I had been on commercial vessels for 12 years and I had heard metal in distress before. The ordinary complaints of a ship working in heavy weather, the creaks and groans that are normal and expected and manageable. This was different. It came from the port side of the ship, from somewhere on the deck below and forward of the bridge, and it was a tearing sound. A high metallic shriek that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, followed immediately by a crash that I felt through the soles of my boots as a distinct physical impact. Then silence for a moment. Then Carl Briggs's voice on the radio, flat and factual. Containers loose, port side, rows 14 through 16, third tier. 3 units. They went over. 3 containers had broken free and gone into the sea. The twist locks on that section of the deck had failed. The cumulative stress of repeated extreme rolling had exceeded what the fittings were designed to handle, and they had let go. 3 steel boxes, each one between 15 and 25 tons depending on their cargo, had shifted, struck the deck rail, and gone over the side into the Pacific Ocean. Gone. In the darkness and spray, they were simply gone. And within seconds, there was nothing where they had been except damaged deck hardware and the grooves they'd left in the steel as they went. The immediate consequence was physical and immediate. The weight distribution of the ship changed. When you remove 20 to 75 tons of weight from one side of a vessel at the 3rd tier height, which is high up, well above the waterline, where weight has maximum effect on stability, the ship's balance shifts. I felt it in my hands before anyone said anything. The helm response changed, subtly but perceptibly, the ship wanting to lean in a slightly different way than it had been. Holloway was already on the intercom to the engine room before Briggs finished his report. Ballast adjustment, port tanks, prioritize. Raymond confirmed, and the process began. Seawater being pumped into ballast tanks on the port side of the hull to replace the lost weight and restore the ship's balance. It would take time. While it was happening, the ship handled differently than it should, and I adjusted at the helm for behavior I was reading in real time rather than anticipating, which is harder, which requires a different quality of attention, that is more tiring and less reliable than working with a ship that's behaving predictably. It was during the ballast adjustment, while I was working the helm harder than I had been, and the ship was in the transitional state between her pre-loss and post-adjustment balance, that I looked at Captain Holloway. I don't know why I looked at him at that specific moment. There was no particular reason. No new alarm, no change in the sound of the engine, nothing that directed my attention toward him specifically. I just looked. He was at the instrument console, studying the stability readout, and his face in the blue light of the displays had an expression that I had not seen on him before, and that I recognized immediately despite never having seen it. It was the expression of a man running calculations and not finding a satisfying answer. It lasted less than a second. Then he straightened, turned to the intercom, and gave Raymond a specific instruction about the rate of ballast transfer. And his voice was the same as it had been all night. Flat, functional, no wasted words. But I had seen it. That fraction of a second when the certainty wasn't there. And I understood, with a clarity that had nothing theatrical about it, that we were in a situation where the outcome was genuinely open. Not likely to go wrong. Not probably fine. Genuinely open. That understanding settled into me and stayed there, and I turned back to the helm and kept working, because there was nothing else to do, and because the work was what mattered, and because the alternative to keeping my hands on those controls was something I wasn't prepared to consider. Tommy Reyes had been in the engine room since 10 o'clock that evening. His station during heavy weather was the electrical control room, a compartment within the engine room space where the ship's power generation and distribution systems were monitored and managed. The Pacific Meridian ran on 3 main generators, any 2 of which were sufficient to power all essential ship systems, with a 3rd in standby for backup. At 2:15 in the morning, generator number 2 began to behave abnormally. The vibration from the storm, the constant, complex, high-amplitude shaking that a ship transmits to everything bolted to its structure in severe weather, had worked at the mounting hardware of the generator over the previous several hours. Bolts had loosened. The brackets holding the generator to its foundation had shifted slightly. The machine was running out of alignment, shaking in ways it wasn't designed to shake, and if the situation continued, it would either damage itself severely or trip its own safety shutdowns and go offline. Generator number 2 going offline was not, by itself, catastrophic. Number 1 and number 3 could maintain power. But number 3 was the backup, and if number 2 went offline and then number 3 had a problem of its own, which in these conditions was not an abstract possibility, the ship would be running on a single generator with no margin. Single generator operation meant reduced power for the bilge pumps, reduced power for navigation systems, reduced capacity for everything that was keeping 20 men alive in the middle of a super typhoon. Tommy assessed the situation, pulled his toolkit, and went to generator number 2. The generator platform is accessed by a metal ladder and sits above the main engine room floor at a height that, under normal circumstances, is unremarkable. Under the conditions of that night, the ship rolling 30+ degrees, the deck moving in complex arcs, the heat and noise of the engine room at full load, getting to the generator platform and working on it was a physical challenge that I am not sure I could adequately describe without understating it. Tommy climbed up there. He braced himself against the generator housing with his body, using his own weight as a stabilizer, and he retorched the mounting bolts one by one with a manual wrench, working by feel in the noise and heat, compensating for the ship's motion with the same continuous physical adjustment that I was making at the helm 4 decks above him. It took him 40 minutes. The generator stabilized. It stayed online for the rest of the storm and the rest of the voyage. Nobody on the bridge knew it was happening. Tommy didn't report it until the following morning, when Raymond Park included it in his engine room log, and it came up in the post-incident debrief. When I heard what he'd done, I sat with it for a moment and tried to find words for it, and couldn't find any that felt adequate. So I didn't say anything at all, which is probably the most honest response I had. At 3:27 in the morning, Marcus Webb said 2 words: rogue wave. A rogue wave is a single wave significantly larger than the surrounding sea state. In normal open ocean conditions, waves have a statistical distribution. Most are close to the average height, a few are larger, a very few are much larger. In a major storm, when the average wave height is already 20 feet, the statistical outliers can be 40 feet or more. They form when wave energy from different directions converges at a single point and combines, multiple wave trains arriving simultaneously and adding their heights together into a single, massive structure of water. They are not predictable. There is no system that gives useful warning. What Marcus saw on the radar was an anomalous return directly off our bow, a signal return larger and more distinct than the surrounding clutter. And in the time between him saying those 2 words and the wave reaching us, there were perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not enough time to do anything meaningful. It is enough time to be aware of what's coming. I held the course. The bow of the Pacific Meridian began to rise. It rose past the angle of any wave we had taken that night, past the angle that had become the new normal for my sense of what the ship's motion felt like. And it kept rising. And through the forward windows of the bridge, there was nothing visible. No horizon, no sky, just water. A wall of dark water filling the entire forward view and continuing upward past the top of the windows. The ship climbed it. The engine was running at full power, and we were climbing a mountain of water in the dark at 3 in the morning in the North Pacific. And for a moment, not a long moment, but a real one, I was not thinking about the next wave or the compass heading or the rudder angle. I was simply present in that moment, completely, with no space for anything else. Then the bow crossed the crest and the descent began. What happened next is the part I've thought about most in the years since, trying to find the right way to describe it. The ship fell. Not gradually, not as a continuation of the wave's slope. The bow dropped into the trough behind the wave at an angle and a speed that produced a sensation of weightlessness in the first instant, the floor going away beneath my feet faster than gravity alone would account for. And then the impact. The hull of the Pacific Meridian hit the water at the bottom of that trough with a force that went through every surface of the bridge simultaneously. Deck, walls, console, windows, as a single physical blow. The sound was enormous. Something came off a console to my right and hit the floor. Ryan Fletcher, in the observer's chair, was thrown forward against the armrests. Holloway grabbed the console with both hands. I held the helm controls and felt the impact travel up my arms and into my shoulders, and stayed on my feet because my legs had been braced for something large, and what arrived was something larger. but still within the range that braced legs could handle. The ship shuddered. For a moment, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, she was buried in the trough, water cascading across the forward deck in quantities that were visible even in the darkness through the spray. And there was a quality to her motion in those seconds that was different from anything before. Sluggish, heavy, as if she was deciding whether to rise. She rose, slowly, with enormous effort communicated through the deck plates into my feet. She lifted her bow and came back to the surface, and the water drained from the forward deck in cascades through the drainage openings in the hull. And the engine was still running, and the lights were still on, and the helm was still responding. Holloway reached for the ship-wide intercom, and his voice was the same as it had been all night. "All hands, report status." The responses came back one by one, from every station, every compartment, every person on the ship. 2 injuries, a broken arm on a crew member in a corridor, 2 cracked ribs on Luis in the galley. Everyone else accounted for. Everyone. Holloway set the intercom down. He looked at the forward windows for a moment. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to all of us, "Keep going." And we kept going. The Typhoon began to lose its grip on us somewhere around 5:30 in the morning. And I know that's a strange thing to say about a storm that was still producing 60-knot winds and 20-foot seas at that hour. But there's a quality to the change that a person who has been in sustained extreme weather for hours learns to recognize before the instruments confirm it. Something in the rhythm of the waves, something in the way the ship moves through them, a slight easing in the relentlessness of it that is not comfort, but is different from what came before. The barometer had bottomed out at 889 millibars sometime around 2 in the morning. I know this from Marcus's log because I wasn't reading instruments at that point. I was reading the sea, and had begun a slow recovery that by 5:30 had brought it to 902. 13 millibars in 3.5 hours. Normal atmospheric pressure is 1,013. We were still 111 millibars below normal, which means the air around us was still being pulled violently inward toward the storm's center somewhere to our west. But it was less violent than it had been, and less is a word that matters enormously when the baseline is what ours had been. The wave period changed first. The interval between one crest and the next lengthened slightly, the rhythm becoming fractionally more predictable, and I felt it through my hands on the controls before I consciously registered it. Then the wind speed dropped from its sustained peak. Not dramatically, not all at once. From 78 knots to 72, then to 65 over the course of about 40 minutes. 65 knots of wind is still a severe storm by any classification. It is still loud, still physically forceful, still a condition in which moving around the ship without holding something is inadvisable, and going out on deck is not permitted. But 65 knots after 78 knots is a different world. And when you have been living in the 78-knot world for several hours, the difference arrives in your body as something close to physical relief, even though nothing about the situation is yet safe or easy or resolved. I was still at the helm. My back had moved beyond aching into a steady burning that I had stopped noticing because noticing it wasn't useful. My hands were functioning, my eyes were on the compass and the sea ahead, and the ship was responding to the controls in a way that felt more predictable than it had an hour before, which meant I could anticipate rather than just react, which is a fundamentally less exhausting way to do this work. The light came at 6:22. Not sunrise in any way that the word usually suggests. There was no color, no particular beauty, just a slow gray brightening of the sky ahead that revealed, incrementally, the extent of what the night had done to the ocean around us. What I saw through the forward windows as visibility improved was a sea state that, even reduced from its peak, was extraordinary. The waves were running at 15 to 18 feet with a disordered, choppy surface. The kind of sea that develops after a major storm as the dominant wave pattern breaks down and the energy disperses into multiple smaller, conflicting wave trains. The foam streaks on the water surface, which form when wave crests blow off in high wind, were still visible, but thinner than they had been during the worst hours, when the sea surface had been almost white with them. The sky was an even, dense gray without gradation, the horizon a slightly darker line against it, and the Pacific Meridian was moving through all of it at 6 knots, her engines still running at high power, still driving forward, still going. I looked at that horizon, the actual, visible, definite line between sea and sky that had been invisible for most of the night, and something happened inside me that I'm not sure I can describe with any precision. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't joy, and it wasn't the release of tension that I might have expected. It was something quieter and more fundamental than any of those things. An acknowledgement, maybe. The horizon is there. The ship is moving. The engine is running. Everyone is alive. Those 4 facts, arriving together in the gray light of 6:22 in the morning, were sufficient. They didn't need to be anything more than what they were, and I didn't try to make them more than that. Holloway finally sat down at 6:45. He lowered himself into the captain's chair on the starboard side of the bridge and sat there for a moment without speaking, looking forward through the windows, and I watched him do it from my position at the helm and understood that the act of sitting down was itself a statement, that the period requiring him to be on his feet and immediately responsive had ended, and we were now in the phase of assessment and recovery rather than active crisis management. He sat for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he got up, went to the chart table, and began working through the post-incident checklist with Marcus Webb. Their conversation was quiet and technical. Damage assessment categories, required notifications, documentation protocols, and it had the ordinary business-like quality of 2 professionals doing their jobs, which was the most reassuring sound I had heard in 9 hours. Marcus had been logging continuously throughout the night, and the log was complete and accurate and would form the basis of the official incident report that maritime regulations require after any significant weather event. Marcus's handwriting in that log, which I saw later, was legible throughout. Not neat, not his normal precise lettering, but legible, which, given the conditions under which it was produced, is an achievement I find remarkable and slightly implausible even having been present for it. My relief, an able seaman named Kevin Torres, came to the bridge at 7:15, and I stepped back from the helm controls and Kevin took over. I stood there for a moment with my hands at my sides and felt them continue to make the small adjustive movements of the previous 10 hours out of pure muscle memory, the nervous system still running the program even though the task had ended. I looked at my hands doing that, and then I put them in my pockets and went to the coffee station and poured whatever had been sitting in the pot for the last several hours and drank it without tasting it, standing at the side console with my back against the bulkhead and my eyes on the sea through the windows. Ryan Fletcher was asleep in the observer's chair. He had been awake for close to 19 hours, had been on the bridge for most of the storm, and had simply reached the end of his capacity and fallen asleep where he sat, still holding the armrests with both hands, head tilted back against the headrest. He was 22 years old, and he had just spent the night in conditions that sailors with decades of experience consider exceptional, and he had not left the bridge, and he had not been in the way, and when the rogue wave hit, and everyone on the bridge lurched and grabbed for something solid, Ryan Fletcher had grabbed the armrests of the observer's chair and held on and stayed in it. I looked at him sleeping, and then I looked out at the sea and thought about the first time I had stood a night watch in heavy weather and what I had felt afterward. A combination of exhaustion and something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief but was somewhere in between. A sense of having passed through something that changed the set of things you knew about yourself. Ryan would feel that when he woke up. It would take a while to understand what it meant, and the understanding would develop over time and over subsequent voyages, and would eventually become part of the structure of how he approached this work. He would be a good officer. I was certain of that, looking at him asleep in the observer's chair with both hands still on the armrests. And I don't think I was wrong. Carl Briggs went out on deck at 7:30, when Holloway judged conditions safe enough for exterior inspection with full safety equipment, survival suit, harness, lifeline clipped to the deck rail at all times. What Carl found out there in the gray morning light was the physical record of the night written in steel. The section of deck where the 3 containers had broken free showed the marks of what had happened. Twist lock sockets torn open, the deck plates scratched and gouged where the container corners had dragged before going over. The rail at the ship's side bent outward at the point of impact. Adjacent containers were still in place, their fittings intact, the stacks above them undisturbed. The line between what held and what didn't was visible and definite, and, looking at it, somewhat arbitrary. The same fittings, the same design, the same installation, but 3 units failed and the rest held. And the difference between those outcomes was determined by the specific loading history of each fitting over the hours of the storm, which is to say it was determined by physics operating at a level of detail that no human being was tracking in real time. One of the forward hatch covers, the large steel panels sealing the cargo holds below deck, had been deformed by wave impact. The panel was no longer perfectly flat. It had a slight bow to it, a curve introduced by the force of water striking it repeatedly from above during the worst of the night. But it was sealed. The hold below was dry. Carl checked the seal around the entire perimeter of the cover and confirmed it was intact, then moved on to the next one. The secondary radar antenna on the mast had been damaged, bent approximately 20 degrees out of true, which didn't affect the primary radar system, but would need to be addressed before the next voyage. Several deck light fixtures were gone entirely, their mounting brackets sheared off cleanly. A section of the deck rail on the port side aft had been struck hard enough to leave a dent the width of a man's torso. Carl documented everything with a camera and a notepad, and came back inside and gave his report to Holloway and Marcus in the same tone he used for routine maintenance reports, which was the only tone Carl Briggs had for anything. The engine room assessment was conducted by Raymond Park over the course of the morning, and his report, delivered to Holloway at 10 o'clock, was a detailed and technical account of what the storm had required from the propulsion and auxiliary systems over the previous 12 hours. The main engine had performed within operational parameters throughout, which, given what it had been asked to do, was not a given. The propeller shaft bearings would need inspection at the next scheduled dry dock. One of the freshwater generators, the machines that produce drinking water from seawater through a distillation process, had developed a minor leak at a fitting that had been worked loose by vibration and had been repaired during the storm by one of the motormans without being logged as an incident because they hadn't wanted to add to the radio traffic at the time, which made Raymond briefly unhappy when he found out, and which made Holloway allow himself a very small and very brief expression of something that might have been amusement before returning to his normal expression. Generator number 2, Tommy's generator, was running normally and showed no signs of the crisis it had been through. The mounting hardware had been retorqued to specification and the machine was stable. Raymond's report noted Tommy's intervention as routine maintenance performed under adverse conditions, which is the kind of understatement that is specific to engineering reports, and to engineers who know that what they're describing was not routine and choose not to make a point of it. The bilge pumps had operated continuously throughout the storm and had kept the lower compartments within acceptable water levels despite the ingress that occurs in any ship in extreme conditions through ventilation systems and fittings under stress. Everything that was supposed to work had worked. The systems that had come close to not working had been caught and corrected by the people responsible for them. The ship was damaged and would require repair, but she was a functioning vessel, and she was heading east toward Los Angeles, and her engine was running, and her 20 men were alive. Luis Garza appeared in the bridge at 8:15 with a cart. He had 2 cracked ribs, confirmed by Marcus's medical assessment, which involved a first aid manual and careful palpation, and the kind of focused attention to detail that Marcus brought to everything. And he had declined the suggestion that he rest and allow the crew to manage their own food for the morning. He said, in the specific way that Luis said things that weren't negotiable, that people needed to eat, and that was his job, and he was going to do his job. The cart had coffee in large thermoses, rice cooked with what he had available, scrambled eggs, toast, fruit from the refrigerated stores that had survived the night intact. He pushed that cart through the ship from the galley to the bridge, to the engine room control station, to the crew quarters, with 2 cracked ribs and the ship still moving in substantial residual seas. And he delivered food personally to every person on the vessel. I watched him come through the bridge door with the cart and felt something that I couldn't have named at the time and still can't name precisely. Not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. And not admiration exactly, though that was part of it too. Something about the specificity of what he was doing. Not a gesture, not a symbolic act, but the actual, physical, practical work of making sure 20 people who had been awake all night in extreme conditions had something hot to eat. The most human possible response to what we had all just been through, and he did it with 2 cracked ribs, without mentioning the ribs unless asked directly. I took the coffee he poured me, and I drank it, and it was the best coffee I have ever had in my life, which I recognize as a statement about circumstances rather than about coffee. The radio contact with the United States Coast Guard, which Marcus had maintained on the required schedule throughout the night, shifted in tone that morning from emergency coordination to incident reporting. The Coast Guard watch officer on the other end of the frequency had a professional, measured manner that matched the situation. Thorough in his questions, efficient in his acknowledgments, neither alarmed nor dismissive. He confirmed our amended arrival estimate, noted our reported damage and casualties for the record, confirmed that the Port Authority in Los Angeles had been notified and would have medical personnel available at the dock for our 2 injured crew members, and advised us of current weather conditions along our remaining track, which had improved significantly now that the Typhoon had moved north and away from our position. The nearest vessel that had been aware of our situation during the night, a container ship 200 miles to our northeast, that had been monitoring the emergency frequency and had offered assistance in the early hours of the morning, had resumed its own voyage, and the watch officer passed along their crew's regards, which is a maritime custom that sounds formal and feels genuine. We were no longer in an emergency. We were a damaged ship making for port with injured crew, which is a serious situation with a clear procedural path. And having a clear procedural path after the formlessness of the previous night was something I felt as physical relief, like setting down a weight I hadn't been aware I was carrying. I went to my cabin at 8:30 in the morning. I sat on the edge of my bunk and looked at the photograph on the shelf. Sarah and the kids on the Oregon coast, all 3 of them laughing. And I picked up the satellite phone and called her. It was early evening in Oregon, which meant she had been awake for most of the night waiting. The shipping company had notified the families the previous evening, when it became clear that we were in a major typhoon and that the situation was serious. Which meant Sarah had spent approximately 10 hours knowing that her husband's ship was in the worst storm the North Pacific had produced that season, and waiting for him to call. She answered on the second ring. I said her name. She said mine. Then neither of us said anything for a moment. And in that moment, I was aware of the satellite connection, the slight delay, the thousands of miles of ocean between the phone in my hand and the phone in hers. And I was aware of my own breathing. And I was aware of the ship moving beneath me in the residual swell. And I was aware that I was sitting on a bunk in a cabin on a vessel in the Pacific Ocean, and she was standing in a house in Oregon. And all of that distance had been, for the previous several hours, a different kind of distance than it normally was. "Are you okay?" she said. Not a question exactly, or not only a question. I told her I was okay. I told her everyone was okay. I told her we'd lost some cargo and the ship had damage, but we were heading for Los Angeles and would be there in about a week. She said okay. Then she said, "I need you to come home." I told her I was coming home. She said, "I mean after this. I need you to come home and stay for a while." I told her I would. She said she was going to go wake up the kids so they could hear my voice. I sat on my bunk and listened to the sounds of my house in Oregon through a satellite phone somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The familiar sounds of my children being woken up, the small protests, the specific quality of my daughter's voice when she hasn't been awake long enough to be fully herself yet. And I held the phone and didn't say much, and didn't need to. After I hung up, I lay back on the bunk without taking my boots off and closed my eyes and was asleep in approximately 45 seconds and did not move for 5 hours. The 5 days between the storm and Los Angeles have a quality in my memory that is different from almost any other period of time I can recall. Not peaceful. There was work to be done, assessments to complete, reports to write, systems to monitor with additional care, the damaged hatch cover to check regularly to confirm the seal was holding, the bent antenna to document for the port engineers, the ongoing management of 2 crew members with injuries that needed more than we could provide at sea. But quiet in a way that was specific to what we had all just been through. The mess room, which on a normal day sees crew members rotating in and out on their break schedules, became a place where people spent more time than their schedules required. Not because anyone organized it or suggested it, but because the impulse to be in the same space as the other people who had been through the same night was apparently shared by all 20 of us, without any of us saying so. People ate together and sat with their coffee afterward and talked, sometimes about the storm, and sometimes about other things entirely, about home, about other voyages, about the particular and unremarkable details of their lives on land that become vivid and specific when you have recently spent time uncertain about whether you'd get back to them. Ryan Fletcher, when he woke up from the sleep he'd finally gotten in the observer's chair, ate a full meal and then sat in the mess room for 2 hours, mostly listening to the older crew members talk. He had the look of someone processing something large, turning it over, finding the edges of it. I sat across from him at one point and asked him how he was doing. He thought about it for a moment, really thought about it, not just reaching for the automatic answer. And then he said he wasn't sure yet. I told him that was the right answer. He nodded and went back to his coffee. Tommy Reyes sat at the same mess table as everyone else during those 5 days and ate his meals and was as quiet as he always was. And nobody treated him differently than they always had, which I think is exactly what he would have wanted. The story of what he'd done in the engine room had circulated through the crew by the morning after the storm, the way information circulates on a ship. Not through any announcement, just through people talking to each other, the way people do when something significant has happened, and they're working out what it means. When it reached the crew members who hadn't been in the engine room that night, the response was the same as mine had been. A moment of sitting with it, followed by an inability to find words adequate to it, followed by going back to whatever you were doing. Tommy, when people acknowledged it, and people did, quietly, individually, without ceremony, accepted the acknowledgement in the same way he accepted everything, without particular reaction, and changed the subject as soon as the opportunity presented itself. He was going home to his wife and daughter on his next shore leave. He was planning to finish the roof section of the house before the rainy season. Those were the things he talked about. The generator was fixed. That was behind him. The house needed a roof. That was ahead of him. That clarity of focus, that ability to look at what's next rather than back at what was, is something I've thought about many times in the years since. Los Angeles arrived on the 8th morning after the storm, a clear Southern California morning with the specific quality of light that belongs to that coast, sharp and bright without the softness of the Pacific Northwest where I grew up. The San Pedro port complex appeared first as a cluster of crane towers on the horizon, enormous structures visible from 20 miles out at sea. And then as we closed the distance, the details resolved. The breakwater, the shipping channels, the density of vessels at anchor waiting for berths, the ordinary busy morning of one of the largest ports in the Western Hemisphere, proceeding exactly as it always proceeded, indifferent to what we had been through to get there. The harbor pilot boarded from a small boat off the breakwater. A compact, efficient man who shook Holloway's hand, took the con, and began the standard communications with the tugs and the Port Authority, speaking in the routine shorthand of a professional who does this multiple times a day, and for whom our arrival was one of several dozens scheduled for that morning. I was on the bridge for the arrival, not as the helmsman of record. Kevin Torres had that watch. But because I wanted to be there when the dock lines went over. I wanted to watch the ship come to rest. The tugs pushed us into the berth with the particular precision of people who have done this 10,000 times, The dock crew caught the lines and led them to the bollards. The line handlers on our deck took up the slack and made fast, and the Pacific Meridian stopped moving. After 12 days of constant motion, after the engine running without interruption from Shanghai to Los Angeles, after the storm, after everything, she stopped, and was still, and was tied to solid ground. I went down the gangway at 9:40 in the morning. The concrete of the terminal was warm from the morning sun and smelled of diesel exhaust and salt and the particular industrial smell of working ports that I've encountered in a dozen countries, and that is always, in its familiarity, a version of arriving somewhere. I reached the bottom of the gangway and stepped off onto the dock, and the ground moved. That's normal. After days at sea, the balance system needs time to readjust to solid ground. And for hours, or sometimes days afterward, you feel the earth rocking under you even when it isn't. I knew this, had experienced it many times, and still found myself stopping and standing still for a moment, feet on the concrete, letting the apparent motion be there without trying to compensate for it. The sun was warm on my face. There were forklifts moving somewhere to my left, and voices, and the sound of the port going about its morning. And somewhere far above me on the ship, I could hear the sounds of the formal arrival procedures beginning. Marine surveyors coming aboard, insurance representatives, port engineers to assess the damage. All of that was necessary, and I would be part of it shortly. But for the moment, I stood at the bottom of the gangway and let the solid, stationary, indifferent concrete be under my feet. And I looked out at the port and the city beyond it and the mountains in the distance. And I thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. And the ground moved under me the way it always does after a long time at sea, and I let it move. The days in port were the unglamorous machinery of aftermath. Marine surveyors documented every piece of damage in methodical detail. The lost containers, the bent antenna, the deformed hatch cover, the deck hardware, the rail damage on the port side aft. Their reports would form the basis of insurance claims and would inform the repair schedule that the ship's owners and the port engineers would develop. Carl Briggs accompanied every surveyor through the exterior spaces with the patience of a man who has done this before and understands that the process serves a purpose even when it moves slowly. Marcus Webb produced the incident documentation, the complete log from the night of the storm, the formal incident report required by maritime regulations, the correspondence with the Coast Guard, the communications record, with the same thoroughness that had characterized his log-keeping during the storm itself. Holloway reviewed everything and signed it, and said very little, which was his way. Luis and the crewman with the broken arm were taken to a hospital near the port for proper medical assessment. Luis had 2 cracked ribs confirmed by imaging, was given appropriate pain management, was told to rest, and came back to the ship the following morning. The crewman's arm required more attention, and he was relieved from the voyage and flown home to his family. Ryan Fletcher flew home to Portland for a week before his next assignment. He shook my hand at the terminal building in a way that was slightly more deliberate than a normal handshake, and he said he'd see me out there, and I told him he would. And I watched him walk away with his bag over one shoulder, and thought that whatever the sea had taken from him, in terms of the particular innocence of the first crossing, what it had given him in exchange was a fair trade. More than fair. I stayed in Los Angeles for 4 days while the repair assessments were completed and the crew turnover was processed. And then I flew home to Oregon. Sarah picked me up at Portland International, and when I got in the car, she looked at me for a moment. Really looked. The way she does when she's assessing whether what she's seeing matches what I've told her. And then she drove. We didn't talk much on the way home. We didn't need to. The kids were at school and the house was quiet, and I sat in the kitchen while Sarah made coffee and I looked at the kitchen. The specific details of it, the particular way the morning light came through the window above the sink, the familiar disorder of the counter, the sound of the coffee maker. And I felt the ground not moving under me, and it was the best thing I had felt in a long time. People ask me, when this story comes up, whether that night changed my relationship with the sea, whether I thought about leaving, Whether, in the weeks and months after Typhoon Merrick, I found myself looking at the water differently, with more fear, with more respect, with something new in the way I understood what I was dealing with when I went out there. The honest answer is that it changed my understanding without changing my relationship. The sea was not new to me after that night. It was more completely itself. I had seen more of what it actually is, experienced a fuller range of what it can do, and come away with a knowledge that was physical rather than theoretical. 12 years of ocean time had taught me the sea intellectually. One night in the North Pacific taught me the rest. Whether that knowledge made me more afraid or less afraid is a question I find difficult to answer because fear, out there, is not the dominant experience. Work is the dominant experience, and fear exists alongside it without interrupting it, the way pain exists alongside physical labor without stopping the labor. What I know is that I understand more clearly now what I am dealing with every time I stand a watch. I understand it not as an abstraction, but as a thing I have felt through the soles of my boots and the palms of my hands, and the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from holding on for 10 hours while the ocean tries to go one way and you are trying to go another. That knowledge is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be comfortable. It is supposed to be accurate, and it is accurate. And accuracy is what keeps you alive out there, which is the only standard that ultimately matters. I still sail. I will sail for as long as my body and my ticket allow it. Not because of what happened that night, and not despite it, but simply because it's what I do. What I've done for 12 years. What I understand how to do at the level where understanding and doing are the same thing. The Pacific Meridian was repaired and returned to service. She's still out there, somewhere on one ocean or another, carrying her containers and her crew and making her crossings. Typhoon Merrick went on to make landfall somewhere in the western Pacific and dissipated over land the way typhoons do, leaving its own record behind in ways I try not to think about too much. The 20 men who were on that ship are scattered now, some still at sea, some ashore, some on different vessels. Ryan Fletcher somewhere in the Pacific with more sea time and more certainty and a different kind of knowledge than he had when he left Shanghai. Tommy Reyes presumably has his roof finished. Carl Briggs is probably standing on some other deck looking at some other piece of equipment and communicating his assessment through a nod. Marcus Webb is probably writing something in a logbook with legible handwriting. Luis Garza is probably feeding people. That's what they do. That's what we do. We go out, and we do our jobs, and we come home, and then we go out again. The ocean doesn't change. The ocean is exactly what it is, every time. The only question is whether you are exactly what you need to be when it decides to show you what that means. That night in the North Pacific, 20 people were exactly what they needed to be. That's the whole story. That's all of it. I don't know how to make it larger than it is, so I won't try.